Hey crafters! We're going to kick it old school a little bit here and just do some good old-fashioned hand embroidery. So I've put together some components, and I think this is going to end up being a series of about 5 videos to cover all of the basic stitches and kind of break them out in some way that makes sense. So look for more of these videos if you want. This one's just going to be on the simple straight stitches, running stitch, back stitch, stem stitch. So some of those really easy basic ones and some variations of those. So what I have in front of me are a couple of different embroidery hoops. I have 2 different fabrics in here. I'm going to bring this up to the camera so you can see it. This one is a woven fabric, and something like this works really nicely. You can get them in the fabric stores, Joann's, Crafts, things like that. It's made for stitching, and it because it has a nice even weave here, you can use that to count the spaces, and that just helps you if you're starting out to get nice even stitches. This other is just a piece of fabric that I had. It's kind of a faux denim. It's got a little stretch to it, and I know that it takes the needle really easily. The needle is just a nice straight needle with a large opening for needle point, but this is, I opted for one with a sharp point. So just there's options. You can have a dull point or a sharp point. The dull point will go through these open weaves really well, but you need a little sharper point when you get to the finer fabric. I also have my embroidery floss here. This is by DMC. That is color number 470. I've got it right here. And I take my DMC and I wind them onto these little cards, and I have had this little pack of embroidery floss. I love this. It's something I've had for years. It's my color palette. It's my paint on fabric, right? So it just keeps everything really organized, and I've just had it forever. So that's something that helps you. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started here. So what I've already done, I maybe should have showed this to you, but I already tied a knot at the end of my thread, and I've already threaded my needle. The very most basic stitch in hand embroidery is called a running stitch. Now a running stitch, all you're going to do is take your needle and come up from the back and go down. Let's bring that up to that knot. There we go. Okay, so just a basic up and down, and then you leave a space. And you go back down. However, that's kind of the slow way to do it. So you can also run this fairly quickly. If you just bring your work down, you can take your needle and go in and then lift up, and then you use your finger and just kind of help guide it so it comes back up. And you can do these really quickly this way, as many as your needle will allow. So you can see now that I've actually put 2 more rows of that running stitch on here. And I did grab another strand of DMC floss. This is color number 741. And what I'm going to do is do what I didn't do the first time around and just thread the needle, which is a nice large hole, so it's very easy to thread. And then I also, when I do knot this, I'm just making what they call I think they call it a surgeon's knot, where you make an overhand knot, but before you tighten that, you take that loop and bring it around a second time. And it just makes a pretty good chunk there. And because I'm working with such a wide weave and I just don't want it sliding through, I'm actually throwing 1 more knot on top of that. So you'll have to just see what your fabric needs. But that makes a nice big knot, and it's going to stay behind the line for me. So 2 more things that you can do with a basic running stitch. Bring up a second thread. Now it doesn't need to be a second color. It can be the same color. I'm using a second color so you can actually see the work. So just know that you have that option. But this is a way to kind of create a variation on this. So the first thing is a laced running stitch. What I'm going to do is take my needle, and I'm just going to, and you can go from top to bottom or bottom to top, and you just bring it under the thread. You don't go into the fabric. Bring it under the thread, and then you go down the next stitch, the opposite direction. And again, make sure you don't catch that fabric. The downside of working with this woven fabric is the needle will catch it more quickly than something that's a little smoother. Okay, got a little more contrasting thread, color number 602, and now I'm going to show you the other option when you have a running stitch, and that's to do a whipped running stitch. So again, just going to put my thread in here. Now this time, and it doesn't matter which way I start, but it matters that I stay consistent. If I go from the bottom up, then I need to continue going through all of these from the bottom up. So you are just going to insert thread into that running stitch and then whip it back around and insert it from the bottom again. So that's called a whipped running stitch. Okay, now I've got another beautiful DMC floss on here. It's color number 334. And we're going to do another kind of I call them the straight stitches. They're great for borders and outlines, things like that. And this running stitch is kind of decorative and spacey and loose and easy. And the next one is a little more of a solid line. It's the back stitch. So you're going to start with your needle, come in from the back. You're going to make a stitch. Then you're going to come up from behind and make your next stitch. Now instead of leaving that gap and moving forward, you're going to go back. Hence the name backstitch. And you're going to go do that same thing over and over. So everything but the first stitch. You're going to make your stitch, come back and cover that space. And you can see that makes a nice solid line. You can use this to go around curves, and when you do, it's really smart to make a little bit smaller stitches if you're doing curvy lines. And you can make fairly large stitches with this as well. Okay, so on this back stitch, you can see that I went ahead and did a little curve. So you can see that this can really follow any line. And then I ran 2 more lines because these stitches also can be laced or whipped. So if you'll remember, just bring your thread up. Again, it could be the same color or a different color. And I'm using a different color just so you can see it. And it's that same yellow that I was using. And with the laced stitch, you're going to bring your needle up a stitch and then back down the stitch. Oh. So we're going up and then down. And you just run that all the way down that line. That can be a way to add an additional color to your work, or a way to thicken the line, and it could be the exact same color and just create a little more of an interesting shape to the line. So it really just depends on what you're actually trying to create. Okay, now, and just like our stitch here with the running stitch where it was whipped, you can also do a whipped back stitch. So again, you're just going to bring your thread up, either the same color or different. And I'm going to go from underneath, and I'm not going through the fabric at all, I'm just going through the thread. And you just whip that right around and come back from the bottom. So you can go from the top down too. It's just a matter of whichever way you start is how you want to continue to go. And because my hoop's rather large, I'm actually going to turn it a little bit, and that way I can hold everything better and put my hand behind the work. And just kind of as I'm doing the stitch, I'm just using my finger to kind of push the fabric and that loop up a little bit, and it's just easier to get under that. Okay, so I've left that pink thread on here, and the next stitch I'm going to show you is called a split stitch. Now in this particular stitch I have my thread doubled over, and I've got 2 lines coming all the way down to the knot. So as you can see, that's 2 strands on the needle. So you're going to start that way for this particular stitch. So it's called the split stitch for obvious, I hope, reasons. You're going to start with your needle going into the fabric. You're going to make your first stitch. Then you're going to come up towards the end of that stitch, but you're going to split it. And then you're going to continue. So it does not go along the side of it. It actually comes up and splits that stitch. Let's see if you can see that there. And that's just another option on a straight running stitch. just about done with all of our straight stitch options, but this one coming up is really an important stitch. It's called the stem stitch. So you start just like the rest by starting from the back and coming forward. You bring your stitch over, and then before you really finish that stitch, come up in the middle here. Well, I guess technically you could finish it as well, but you want to get kind of right underneath here, so it's easy sometimes not to finish it. And you don't split your thread, but you come along the side of it, right in the middle, and then you make your next stitch. So if you prefer, you can actually hold this down out of your way and then come up in between and then bring everything taut. The reason they call this stitch the stem stitch, and this is, by the way, the third option, is to hold this out of the way, and it looks like a back stitch a little bit, but you're only coming halfway back. But this particular stitch is used frequently for plant stems. It gives a little more of a continuous line and kind of fills it in more. So it's just a very popular stitch for plants. That is the stem stitch. Okay, now just like those other stitches, I've run a second row here of the stem stitch, and again you can use another piece of embroidery thread and enhance that. Now you can choose to go with the stitch, because as you can see with the stem stitch, it has a little bit of a twisted look already, so you could continue with that, or you can go against it. I'm going to continue with it, so I'm going to actually go through. And here's the thing, I've got a half a stitch here and the half of the next stitch here. I'm going to go through both of those at the same point and make sure I don't go through the rest of my stitching. And then I'm going to come over and do the same thing. Keep trying to catch that second line. So by doing that, you can actually create a very, very twisted look. So that's just one more option. You know, with any of these stitches, you can always do things to enhance it, like doing this twist. Okay, this is the last thing I'm going to show you in my run of straight stitches. This is called couching. So this is when you have something, and I've just gathered several cords together, but maybe you have a thick piece of cording or something that you want to have on as an outline, for example. Well, what you would do is use your embroidery floss. I'm just going to get this in here so we can get it started first. Would come over that large cord and wrap it and come right back down real close to where it started. So you would just capture this, whoops, and don't pull it out. And this might be a larger thread, it might be a little usually it's some kind of cording or something. And you can make these stitches far apart like I just did for this stitch, or you can make them closer together. In general, they're somewhat far apart, but if you're going through curves, then you're going to want them to be closer. Okay, crafters, thanks for joining in. This was the whole series on the straight stitches, the outlining stitches, the kind of inline stitches without getting too fancy. And there are several other groups of stitches, so stay tuned because I'm going to go over several more. So again, in this one we have a running stitch, we have a laced running stitch, we have a twisted running stitch, we have a back stitch, which you can use to make curves. We have a laced back stitch and a twisted back stitch. We have a split stitch, a nice big bulky stitch. We have the stem stitch, very popular for stems. And then we have a twisted stem stitch or a whipped stem stitch. And then we have couching, which means you've taken something rather large and you've just grouped it with these little tiny stitches. And by the way, I didn't mention on the couching, but I actually only used 3 strands of the DMC floss. I actually split the 6 strand in half and only used 3. And then the grouping that I put this around was about 4 strands wide. So you definitely would have something a little bulkier with something a little smaller. Again, depends on what you're making. You might want to have something that's a very narrow strip with a very large couching stitch over it. So it's really up to you. But I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll stay tuned for more.